Perturabo, the Lord of Iron, Master of Olympia, and the 4th Legion Astartes, the Iron Warriors. And in proper Horus Heresy fashion, which often begins with quotes from people from our own time, I want to start this by a quote from Winston Churchill. Russia is a riddle wrapped in a mystery inside an enigma, and there is no better way to describe Perturabo than that. He is a complex and oft contradicting character. At once he is the Emperor's unbending Lord of Iron, entrusted with the harshest of tasks because of the surety that he would not break no matter what. And yet, he was also amongst the first to bend the knee to Horus and offer his services in return for forgiveness of his perceived transgressions, perhaps? Simultaneously, Perturabo was a man of peace, an architect, a builder, a philosopher, and also the man whose first official act as commander of the 4th Legion Astartes was to have a 10th of the Legion beaten to death by their own comrades through the act of decimation. How does one even begin to explain such polar opposites? That is a very good question. So let us do what we always do and start at the very beginning of Perturabo's story. And interestingly, it does not begin from the start of the Primarch's memories. If one were to ask the Lord of Iron himself what his early life was like, and by some miracle you would actually get an answer, he would state that his life as he knew it began halfway up a rain-slick cliff. That is quite the first memory, and he would furthermore tell you that he had no idea as to how he got to be there, as to how he came to be clinging to a sheer rock face in a rainstorm for his dear life. Indeed, some of his very first thoughts were of betrayal and abandonment, were of wondering who could have abandoned a child on a cliff face like this in a rainstorm. And to make matters worse, Perturabo was swiftly running out of strength. He had to make a decision. Did he keep climbing, hoping to reach the top of the cliff, or was the bottom closer? Did he go forwards or backwards? Even as the last ebbs of endurance were threatening to abandon him, he decided that he would always go forward. And through sheer determination and stubbornness, he climbed up the cliff. And finally, having expended almost all of his energy, he hauled himself to safety, only to be met by a small group of soldiers who, just so it happened, was looking for Perturabo. Why? Why were they looking for him? How do they know who he was? How do they know where to find him? Perturabo himself had no idea why there were armed men looking for him. Intrigued, Perturabo simply just chose to go along with the soldiers and meet their leader, the tyrant Damokos. Clearly, we are missing something, and so we must go even further back to when little baby Perturabo bent apart the iron shell of his gestation pod to take his very first breath of Olympian air. Unlike some of his brothers, Perturabo was not immediately discovered by the human population of the planet. Instead, Perturabo spent his first year of life bothering the local sheep populace and being chased around by sheep herders. You see, they took a dim view of the young Primarch eating their charges and turning their hides into rough covering for his ever-growing body. Perturabo wasn't overly bothered by the less than friendly attentions of the local livestock owners. He didn't have much of a frame of reference for anything at this point. All he knew was that he was hungry and naked. Conveniently, a sheep would solve both of those problems at once. And whilst he felt a certain kinship with the herders themselves, he couldn't quite express why. and he seemingly never felt a real urge or draw towards their society, unlike, again, certain other Primarchs. Ferrus Manus, for example, the very first time he laid eyes upon humans, he immediately felt an urge to go towards them and join them. Perturabo clearly had no such drive. But one day, when engaged in the usual rounds of hide-and-seek with the locals, the chase was violently interrupted. As usual, Perturabo had easily outpaced his pursuers and was halfway up a cliff when he heard a scream. A rationalist, first and foremost, Perturabo ensured that he was safely at the top of the cliff before turning around to have a look at what was causing all the ruckus. One of the sheep herders, a young child, Perturabo figured by his build and stature, had been swept up in the mouth of an enormous serpentine monster. The rest of the herders were attacking the creature with their crude weapons, both their sticks and their staves, but were clearly no threat to it as it simply stayed in place whilst the young herder slid further down the beast's gullet. The herders were shouting something at Perturabo, who sat high and safe upon a cliff. He could not understand what they were saying, but he was pretty sure it was something along the lines of, "Hey, you really just gonna watch this, bruh?" Good question. What would the Primarch do? Well, he wasn't entirely sure. He thought about it for a solid minute, an eon in Primarch terms. The engineered sons of the Emperor are able to make spatial calculations for entire fleets at speed in their heads. And here was Perturabo taking a full 60 seconds to consider the situation. Before, finally, turning and walking away as the herders continued their futile struggle against the serpent. Cold. Now, if I had to describe Perturabo in just one word, that would be precisely it. Cold. But don't mistake his caution for a complete lack of empathy, at least not yet. Perturabo had simply concluded that as he was right then and there, his chances of killing the beast were distant at best. He realized this within the first few seconds of laying eyes upon it. Perturabo was still just a boy, an incredibly well-built boy, but a boy nevertheless. Neither did he possess any arms or armor. He would have had to strangle the beast with his bare hands or crush its bones with brute force, and all with nothing more than poorly fitting sheepskin rags to protect him. If anything, we should instead dwell on the idea that Perturabo, understanding that his chances of victory were slim to non-existent, still took a full minute to consider the situation. I would therefore suggest that he was looking for a persuasive reason to act. What kinship did he have with the herders? None to speak of. What were they to him? Enemies, if anything. What was in it for him to act? Nothing. And yet this biological supercomputer still took a full minute to come to the conclusion that he should do nothing. What other explanation could there be than that Perturabo did not like the answer that he came up with, and was feverishly racking his brain for any convincing reason to actually intervene? But he couldn't find any, and merely wanting to intervene itself, the need, the urge, the emotion, was not enough in his mind. However, again, whilst Perturabo, even at this early stage in development, was clearly a consummate rationalist, and had decided, therefore, that he could not, with any real degree of certainty, defeat the monster, he had not yet grown to be the unfeeling Perturabo that we will see in the future. As at this point in time, the act of not saving that young boy, the act of not even trying, clearly bothered Perturabo greatly, because he then went on to do something that he had never done before. Up until this point, he had avoided interactions with human society. Despite feeling a vague kinship with them, he had avoided them. He had not sought them out. He had only interacted with them in the most superficial fashion when he was nabbing their ships for food and clothing. And yet now, he sought out a human village. He sought it out because he knew that at the heart of this village was a small blacksmith's workshop. This gives us another indication of Perturabo's early fascination with human society, as he must clearly have been observing this village for quite some time. How else would he know that there was a blacksmith in the village? And how else would he even know what a blacksmith was if he hadn't been paying attention to it? He must have seen the smiths go into the workshop with metal, come out with tools or weaponry, or perhaps he even observed the smith directly in his work. Regardless of how he knew about the smith, Perturabo now walked straight into the village, as if he owned the place, and wandered directly to the blacksmith and inside of it, wherein the shocked blacksmith was suddenly face to face with this incredibly well-shapen and massively muscular boy. Bearing in mind also this was a highly religious society, where they believed that the gods would send gifts or demigods or items down below, this boy now started pointing to various instruments, various pieces of metal and resources. The smith, of course, quickly gathered the gist of things, and whilst the young Primarch could not speak the language of the local humans at this point, his intent was obvious, and as Perturabo started working the forge, the smith eventually began assisting him. He had undoubtedly heard some rumors about the strange boy running free in the mountains, and again, this being a highly religious society, may have drawn all sorts of conclusions based upon those rumors. And here was a evidently very strange individual working his forge, with an aptitude and expertise that should have been far beyond anyone of his years. Slowly but surely, the two continued their work in silence, the veteran blacksmith assisting the strange young boy, until eventually Perturabo emerged from the smith holding his very first creation, an iron weapon. Perturabo had now acquired the means with which to defeat the monster. The weapon was a crude thing in comparison to the many wonders he would craft later, and even in comparison to the perfect sword that he would create at Damocos's court, this was undoubtedly a more limited achievement. But it proved to be enough. And several days later, Perturabo showed up at another village. The village where the sheep herders lived. He was carrying the severed head of the monster that had murdered the young herder, and he found himself standing outside of the hut of the young boy's father. Perturabo had started being able to pick up more and more of the local human speech, and was able to hold a stilted yet informative conversation with the herder. He had come to deliver the monster's head. He had not been able to save his son, but he had brought him revenge, if nothing else. Unfortunately for Perturabo, the locals, well, the Olympians lived a hard life, to put it mildly, and they were a somewhat cynical bunch. Whilst the herder was of course very grateful that Perturabo had slain the monster that killed his son, it's a little late, isn't it? And so he kind of talked to Perturabo about another monster in need of slaying. It's clear here that the farmer, again presumably perhaps due to the religiosity of the world and viewing Perturabo as a divine creature rather than as a human, that he figured that he could get some more service out of him. As for Perturabo, he was very much so aware of the fact that he was being used, but he didn't necessarily mind. He had an attachment to these humans, and despite all logic and reason, he'd killed the first monster, despite not being involved with these people in the slightest, so why not kill a second one? And this time around, the beast turned out to be a hydra. It was a significantly tougher customer than the first creature, but once again Perturabo emerged victorious. And now people started leaving out gifts for him. They started leaving him food, clothing, tailored clothing. Up until this point, he had literally just been wearing the rags of sheeps. Now he saw what actual clothing could be. He saw the stitching. He was given utensils. And he started to figure out ideas and concepts around this. Oh, so I use these to eat, do I? Oh, I wear these, do I? These are pants. They're stitched together in so-and-so a fashion. And once he saw them, he then began to figure out, these are fairly crude. I could probably do better now that I understand what they're for and why I should want them. And so that is exactly what he did. After having been gifted crude utensils, he crafted finer ones for himself. After having been gifted crude clothing, he swiftly grew out of them and crafted finer clothing for himself, utilizing the material that was given to him as he traveled the world slaying monsters and becoming quite famous. So now we know why a group of soldiers had been dispatched to find him. It was because, in the eyes of the local populace, again, very religiously minded, Perturabo appeared as a demigod, a semi-mythical creature, roaming the lands, slaying monsters, and creating works of considerable beauty and artifice, despite, by all appearances, being nothing more than a savage wilderness child. These are absolutely the kind of rumors that would, eventually, inevitably, reach the ears of high society, in this case personified in one single individual, Damokos, the tyrant of the city-state of Lokos. If you haven't already noticed, I mean, it was ever so subtle after all, Olympia is essentially ancient Greece, but in space, which, I mean, fair enough. I feel like we missed an opportunity here to make the Iron Warriors basically just space hoplites, but I suppose we've got the Minotaurs chapter for that, so not too bad, not too bad. Damokos had dispatched one of his favored captains to track down this miraculous boy and bring him back to his court. Of course, Damokos expected this mission to take months, years, possibly. I mean, how do you even track down a feral mythical child? And that's, of course, assuming that he was even real in the first place. Again, this was a world with a great deal of religious thinking and mythicism. They believed, for example, that rain was something created by the gods themselves, rather than a natural phenomenon, though Perturabo would later question that theory, and would even present an alternative hypothesis, talking about how rain was probably a result of water that already existed within the world in lakes and oceans and so on, evaporating, travelling up into the skies, and then eventually coalescing and falling back down again as rain. But we are getting somewhat ahead of ourselves, are we not? Again, Damokos expected this to take forever, and yet, here he was. Perturabo was introduced to him within a day or two. How could this be anything but divine providence? Surely this was but more evidence of Perturabo's exceptional nature. Though Damokos was still not entirely convinced. He had heard many wondrous tales of this youth, and seeing him here now in the flesh, a lot of it was immediately made obvious as the truth. Perturabo was still a boy. He was in his first year of life, and yet his physique would have been flawless, as if chiseled from the purest marble. But Damokos also recalled a great many tales of this mystical feral child creating items of considerable artifice. And Damokos wanted a demonstration, and so he had a mobile forge wheeled out and told Perturabo to make something. Perturabo agrees. I mean, why not? These people clearly have some technology that he hasn't seen before, and before we get into what Perturabo chooses to make, there is one thing we need to touch upon as well, because I see this gotten wrong many places. It is often stated that Perturabo was very different from his brothers because he instantaneously understood the world around him. Like, he looked at a wall and went like, oh, I know exactly what that is and how you build it. Oh, that architectural marvel over there, yeah, I know how to build that. Oh, that armor, yeah, I can beat that out in a forge 5 minutes flat, no issues. That's not actually the case. When Perturabo was clinging to that cliff and suddenly woke up and like, huh? Why am I here? That was a storm of knowledge, apparently. Perturabo explains this phenomenon on a couple other situations as well. He talked about how, like all of the other Primarchs, he had a lot of knowledge. For example, when we first meet Korax, he is able to analyze the air around him, and through that analysis figure out that, oh, it must be cold and there must be ice nearby. Perturabo has the same thing, but to an even greater degree. Additionally, he has a flaw, perhaps, or perhaps his recall is simply too strong, where occasionally he will see something, he will learn new things, and that will unlock a door in his mind, and the knowledge will simply come flooding out and wipe out all of his memories previous to that moment. This has happened on at least 2 occasions, the latest and last of which, of course, being when he was climbing the cliff. After that, he was led to Damocos's court, and he already had that strange, hollow, sinking feeling, as if everything he laid his eyes upon, he kind of already knew, he kind of already understood. But there were certain objects in Damocos's court that he had not seen before. For example, the guards appeared to be carrying some form of energy weaponry. Perturabo understood enough to realize that it was a weapon of some sort, but he had no idea how it functioned. And so, of course, he really wanted to know. And if all that was required to allow him to stay was to demonstrate his capabilities to this man who called himself Tyrant, well, easy enough. Indeed, Perturabo even quite enjoyed the act of shaping the metal, and so he spent hours at this mobile forge whilst Damocos sat upon his throne enraptured by what he was seeing, whilst the court surrounding them were, well, the nobles were less interested. It was an amusing enough diversion at first, but when they were starting to creep into the 2nd and the 3rd hour, most had long since lost interest, though, again, Damocos was still absolutely enraptured by this marvel that was being worked right in front of his very eyes. Now, of course, as we all know, this wasn't the first time Perturabo had crafted a weapon, but he had grown considerably in skill ever since then, and when he was finally done, he presented to the Tyrant of Locos a perfect sword. Quite the improvement on what the young Primarch had hammered out previously, and Damocos was, of course, suitably impressed. In his mind, all of the rumors, all of the myths, all of the legends had been proven true with the making of this masterpiece. Damocos immediately offered Perturabo to become an apprentice to his metalworkers, promising that it would be a fine life, but Perturabo had other things in mind. He gestured towards the high arch ceiling of Damocos's court, and he pointed towards an energy weapon holstered at a soldier's belt. He wished to learn about architecture. He wished to learn about weaponry, because that is where his true value lay. And Damocos, of course, was overjoyed. This mysterious youth wanted to not only just serve him as an ironsmith, as a weaponsmith, as a creator of marvels, he claimed to be an architect and a warrior as well. Like every Christmas and birthday come at once, Damocos declared that Perturabo must surely have been a gift from the gods, from Anoinkai, the goddess of fortune in particular. Perturabo was not best pleased by this mention of the gods. He even asked what gods were, and a priest stepped forward to try and explain it to him. Perturabo, at this point not knowing what a priest was, instantly had a dislike for the man and even thought a priest, as if it was something disgusting. something shameful that had appeared in front of Perturabo. This is an interesting thing, because how did he know? How did he arrive at that conclusion? How does he know what a priest is, and yet does not know what a god is? Perhaps this was simply part of Perturabo's stubbornness, his unwillingness to subject himself to any other authority beyond his maker, or perhaps it was a part of his programming, an instinctual rejection of the very idea of religious worship. Who knows? He then goes on to question Damokos a bit. Damokos, of course, offers him to live at his court. Damokos will provide Perturabo with all of the knowledge he wants, and he will even give him the ability to explore his passions, and to become whatever it is that Perturabo thinks he can become. But in return for this, Damokos required Perturabo to serve him and to serve Lokos. And now we get a very interesting exchange, which I'm going to read for you word for word, because it is quite fascinating and open to a great deal of interpretation. "Then stay here with me," said Damokos. "You shall learn all we can teach you. I will help you discover your place of origin, but you must serve our city in return. In battle? Maybe. What of peace? You made a sword. You could have made a plough. What of peace?" Perturabo repeated. A hot feeling stirred in him. He did not like it. Damokos smiled unconvincingly. "There will be peace. No one attacks Lokos. They see our walls of our city and they give up in despair and retreat. Lokos has not been successfully sieged in 600 years. War is necessary, boy, but never desirable. There is always time for peace." The boy's cold expression froze, the tyrant's mirth. Damokos' smile set on his face. "Liar," the boy's expression said. "What use are walls against someone who refuses to give up?" "I have not yet met such a person," said the tyrant, but in his heart he knew that the very person was standing in front of him, dripping with sweat from the heat of the forge. "If you are to serve me, I must know you. Tell me your name." "It is Perturabo." And there you have it. A very interesting conversation, is it not? Because on the one hand, it could certainly be interpreted as Perturabo being very hesitant to accept Damokos' offer because he knows he will be turned into a weapon of war. And when Damokos then reassures him that there will be peace, no one will attack my walls, and whilst war is sometimes necessary, it is not something we should long for, Perturabo seems doubtful, but at the same time almost also hungry. The very first time I read that conversation, my takeaway was he wants it. Perturabo wants war. He wants to be a warrior, and he might not necessarily like it, as described by that strange feeling he feels within him, but he does. Deep down, as a part of him, he knows that he is a warrior. Again, Damokos brings up an excellent point when he says, "You could have made a plough," because at no point did Damokos instruct Perturabo as to what it was he was going to create. Now, you could give one excuse here as well, namely that Perturabo may not have known what a plough was. Now, yes, of course, he would have the knowledge of a plough somewhere buried deep within his memory, but as we've seen previously, until he was given utensils, he didn't think to create them, and so the idea of creating a plough may simply not have occurred to him. But I think instead, this is the earliest indication of the duality of the young Primarch. The divide between Perturabo, the man of peace, the architect and the philosopher, and the Lord of Iron, the warlord of the Iron Warriors, the butcher and the general. But it is quite a few years yet before Perturabo really has to wrestle with that duality. For now, he had been accepted into Damokos' court. He would be given access to all of the information he wanted, and he would be allowed to learn anything and everything that he wished. And Perturabo, of course, wanted to know it all. He devoured knowledge like a starving man that suddenly comes across a mountain of cheeseburgers. Nothing was ever enough for Perturabo. He needed more and more and more. And Damokos did his best to feed Perturabo's obsession, but it simply was not possible. He was insatiable. As soon as you'd put a book in front of him, he would have finished reading it, learning it, and rewriting it in an evening. And if you gave him a new tutor, he'd suck him dry of all knowledge and leave him as nothing more than a withered husk, only capable of wallowing in self-pity as he realizes just how little it was that he actually knew. And Damokos, of course, was speechless. This gift from the gods superseded his wildest expectations. Not even in the most ridiculous and overblown of myths could Perturabo's equals be found. Never before had the world of Olympia seen anything even remotely close to this. Yet Damokos tried his best to keep his word and give Perturabo all of the knowledge that he desired. Once all of the tutors and wise men of Lokos, once all of the libraries were exhausted, he sent out for tutors from the other great fortress cities. He sent Perturabo's writings to them. He asked them to come and tutor this gift of the gods. And every time, the same pattern repeated. A tutor would come, Perturabo would learn from him for a few days if he was really good, or a couple hours if not, and soon Perturabo would simply just state that he had learned everything that this man could possibly teach him. And when the tutor, unsurprisingly, got quite miffed at this, Perturabo would routinely humiliate him in displays of wits and debating skills, to the point where it started to get quite difficult indeed to convince anyone to come and actually match wits with the Wonder Child. Damokos spared no expense in Perturabo's education. He granted him access to any and all knowledge that he wished, just like he had promised, and he ensured that Perturabo had been thoroughly educated in every single field that he could think of. The arts, the sciences, natural philosophy, religion, warfare, anything and everything, and Perturabo, of course, ate it all up. And we do also have to mention that Damokos did not do this purely out of the kindness of his own heart either. Damokos was an Olympian, and more so, he was a tyrant of one of Olympia's massive city-states. This is a volatile position, to put it mildly. Olympia is a harsh world, and its populace has grown cynical and abusive, to the point where even the peasant, the sheep herder who had his son devoured by the monster early on in the story, even he, upon seeing Perturabo with the head of the creature held in his hand, his first instinct was to try and get Perturabo to kill another monster. His first instinct, in other words, was to try and find some way to use Perturabo to his own benefit. And Damokos was no different. If anything, he would be even more so eager to do this, because again, being a tyrant is not exactly a stable occupational position. You are one among several grand leaders on Olympia, and there is a great deal of friction between the various leaders of the city-states. Assassinations, open warfare, betrayal, and traps were far from uncommon. A man in Damokos' position had to possess a certain blend of ruthlessness and efficiency, even just to survive, never mind thrive. There is even a quote from the book Hammer of Olympia that illustrates this point beautifully, said by Adolphus of Cardis, quote, "The day a man of Olympia loses his paranoia is the day he loses his life." End quote. And on that note, I suppose this would be the perfect opportunity to demonstrate one of the ways in which Damokos used Perturabo for his own benefits, since it involves that very same Adolphus who made that quote. Adolphus of Cardis was the tyrant of another major city-state on Olympia, and one that Damocos had been very interested in forming an alliance and a trade treaty with for quite some time, as it would benefit Locos immensely. First and foremost, of course, it would protect Locos against any military action taken from Cardis, and the trade deal would also ensure that the coffers of Locos grew nice and fat indeed. But Cardis was aware of this as well. Cardis knew that such a deal would benefit Locos far more than it would Cardis. And so Adolphus, its tyrant, had been very hesitant, very resistant against any such ideas. And yet Damocos invited him over to his court to show him Perturabo, the gift of the gods, and Adolphus was tempted. I mean, think of it this way. Again, in a very religious society like this, you get a message from your arch nemesis, your arch enemy, and he says, "Hey, wanna come have a look at the literal Jesus Christ of our religion? He does miracles and everything." You're probably gonna go like, yes, I would like to do that, thank you very much. And hey, of course, he has no intentions of agreeing to any trade deal or any alliance, so as far as Adolphus is concerned, this will only benefit him. And so he goes, and he receives a demonstration, first and foremost, of Perturabo's incredible artistic talents. Adolphus and Damocos sit on lounges as Perturabo sketches them, and within minutes he has created a sketch of such incredible realism that it might as well be a photograph. After having, leaned over the side of his reclining couch to pick his jaw off the floor, Adolphus then demands that Damocos explain the trick to him. How did he do this? How did Perturabo cheat? Because surely this is impossible. And yet Damocos simply just smiles and goes, "Nope." That's just Perturabo. And Adolphus just flat out refuses to believe it, until Damocos starts baiting him. "Oh, about that alliance, how about that alliance?" And Adolphus is just like, "Nah, fuck you." And eventually, Damocos keeps, saying that, no, there's no trick, this is actually just Perturabo, he's just incredible in every single way. By the way, Adolphus, which, by the way, the more I say that, the more I keep thinking Adolphus, so if I get that wrong, you will know why. Hey, by the way, Adolphus, didn't you bring some kind of champion fighter? Well, a really good fighter, eh? Didn't you? Didn't you bring somebody like that, with a smile spreading slowly across his face? And Adolphus, seeing the trap laid out right in front of him, and even knowing, oh, probably shouldn't step in that, yet he can't figure out the gist. He can't figure out what the trap is. He can't figure out what the snare is. And so he says, "Yes, I did. Ortraxes Folk, who apparently is some huge deal, the winner of tournaments, worldwide renown, etc. He's his personal champion. I did bring him, he's in my bodyguard." And Damocos then suggests, well, if you think Perturabo could somehow cheated with the painting, how about I have Perturabo fight your invincible champion? And Adolphus, again, is just confused. Are you serious? Perturabo is still a teenager, essentially, or leaning towards a child. He certainly doesn't look like he should be any match for a fully grown man, much less a champion of Olympia. And again, however, Adolphus knows this is a trap, and yet he can't quite see it. And so Damocos says, well, if you're a bit of a coward, we could bet on it. If you win, not only will I never talk to you about the alliance ever again, I will disappear from your life. Totally. And Adolphus goes, you do that, and you pay my city 40 pounds of silver in tribute per year, and we have a deal, because of course, he has no idea what he's agreeing to. And Damocos immediately just, done. because he knows what he's agreeing to. And so the champion of Adolphus, or Traxes, goes into the ring against Perturabo, and gets his ass annihilated in seconds, as Damocos, of course, knew he would. Indeed, Damocos, feeling generous, I presume, even stops the fight a moment before Perturabo is about to crush Ortraxes' throat. And, of course, I'm sure you can guess what Damocos wanted if he won. Yes, indeed. An alliance with Cadiz and a trade deal. All successfully negotiated, despite the essential impossibility of the task, entirely due to Perturabo. And that, of course, is but one in hundreds, if not thousands of ways that Damocos used Perturabo, used his reputation, his abilities, his physique, both for, in this case, straight-up agreement, and also, of course, for prestige. Again, having a gift of the gods living in your citadel, that undoubtedly gives you some gravitas at the local meeting of tyrants. But I would also hasten to add that the mere fact that Damocos did indeed use Perturabo should not be interpreted in a way so as to suggest that Damocos didn't care for Perturabo. He absolutely did. He viewed Perturabo as a son and would eventually go on to adopt him. And despite his crippling lack of trust, he tried his best, he genuinely did, to open up to Perturabo. He tried to show him love, though, again, this was a difficult society to do any such thing in. Perturabo himself grew up to be quite the paranoid little bastard. Indeed, Adolphus, in this very example, after having seen his victory over his champion, offers Perturabo a goblet of wine, a toast to his victory, and Perturabo simply just stands there, staring at Adolphus like he was some form of sewer sludge that had just crawled out from beneath the flagstones and spat upon Perturabo's feet. Damocos had to interject and explain that ever since a man called Zinard of Sodalian had tried to poison Perturabo with an entire barrel of poisonous wine, Perturabo was no longer quite so trusting as he had once been. And oh boy, that must have been quite some barrel. I mean, a Primarch could drink raw oil and piss lubricants and take no damage or suffer any ill effect from the process, and yet this wine was bad enough to make Perturabo go, maybe I shouldn't accept drinks from strangers anymore. The colourful phrase, like pissing barbed wire, comes to mind. I can only imagine that was what turned Perturabo off the grape, at least for a period of time. But once again, this goes to some length to illustrate that, yes, Olympia was a pretty dangerous society, particularly for the upper class, and with the tyrant, that position being the highest office in the land, it was also one of the most dangerous for the person holding it. And as Perturabo quickly noticed, you didn't even have to be a tyrant, you didn't even have to have a proper position within that society. Merely being remarkable or the source of strength for someone else in a position of power, that alone could get you assassinated. Again, Damocos may certainly have used Perturabo, he absolutely did, but Perturabo also did, in a way, use Damocos. He used him for access to his libraries, for his connections to the learned and the wise men of the planet. He used him to broaden his own horizons. And later on, he would certainly use him as a power base as well to begin his conquests of Olympia. This was not a completely one-sided relationship. I might even go so far as to say that it was, at the very least in part, symbiotic. And I would also, again, stress that Damocos really did come to care for Perturabo. And he tried his best to make this obvious. He tried to bring Perturabo closer to him. We see this in one particularly interesting interaction that the two have in Perturabo's study. The soon-to-be Lord of Iron had claimed an entire tower in Lokos for his own, a 15-story-tall structure that had become his lair, as Damokos described it. One day, Damokos came to see his son. He ordered his guards to stay outside, and he began to climb the 15 floors up to the top of the study when he knew his son would be sitting hard at work at one of his drawings. Perturabo had crafted countless works of architectural brilliance, but only on paper. That is a key thing for the future as well. Perturabo had laid out plans for ginormous bathhouses to service the entire populace of Lokos. He had crafted revolutionary systems of Medicare, of waste disposal. Perturabo had plans to drastically change and improve upon virtually every facet of Olympian society, but never seemingly really got around to doing any of it. Anywho, Damokos eventually arrived at the top of the tower, where indeed he found his adopted son hard at work at a drawing. Damokos knew that Perturabo knew that he was here. Damokos had learned over the course of the years that Perturabo's hearing was an order of magnitude better than, well, seemed possible even. Perturabo knew that his father had arrived, and yet he said nothing to greet him. Perturabo knew, but he didn't care. And the upcoming conversation in that part of Hammer of Olympia is really quite telling. Damokos is almost afraid to breathe, it says, until finally, upon having been ignored for long enough, he gets a bit annoyed at it, frankly, and he sends a bit of a barb his son's way. "You are hard at work at one of your follies again, son?" And Perturabo simply goes, "Why do you use that word? You know I don't like it." To which Damokos responds, "Follies or son?" Already you can see kind of the barbs between the two, and the entire conversation is downright painful, really. Damokos immediately regrets his barb because he knows that Perturabo will hold on to that for weeks. Perturabo apparently nurses every grudge, every slight against him, and takes it all to the extreme. Anything and everything said against him, even something as innocent as laughter at something that Perturabo did not intend to be funny, that is something that Perturabo will consider a deep and hurting insult, which he will carry with him for absolute ages. And you can see this also in his conversation with Damokos here. Damokos is trying to open up to Perturabo, and yet he refuses every advance Damokos makes, and that in turn makes Damokos angry, and he sends yet further verbal jibs and jibes at Perturabo, who answers in kind, yet further tearing away at their relationship. Let me just give you a few examples to illustrate what I'm talking about. Damokos scoops some piles of papers just haphazardly strewn across the floor, and he's amazed at it. He states that the wise men of the city should be made aware of these drawings because they are incredible. And what does Perturabo respond to this with? "Why should they be interested?" he says. "They have their ancient certainties. I would hate to upset them by presenting them with the new." Holy shit. That is some petulant 12-year-old bullshit. Like, I know my shit's really cool, but these old people, they don't understand my coolness. Like, holy shit, this is a Primarch here. When Damokos then leans in to look at what he's working at now, he praises it. "Is that a theatre? It's magnificent," he says. And Perturabo just turns at him and sighs, like, "What do you want, my lord?" Fucking hell. Damocles continues to insist that all he and his family has done has been to reach out to Perturabo and try to embrace him, and Perturabo just shouts at him. He throws a hissy fit, essentially, shouting that all Damocles has ever done was try to use him, to self-aggrandize himself by using Perturabo's intellect, by using his skill. He starts grabbing wonderful models and drawings in workshops and destroying them, while shouting, "You've never used me for anything like this. My architecture, you turned to bastions. My mathematical equations, you turned to tools of war," and so on. He's straight up just shouting at his adoptive father, who honestly hasn't done much in the way of wrong here. He admits it, yeah, I have used you, Damocles says, as we know he has, but you have used me too. Because that is the truth of it. Perturabo petulantly says that fathers don't use their sons, and Damocles retorts, and next you will say that sons don't use their fathers, but they do. For food, for shelter, for love. Yes, even love. And he has a point. Again, this was not a one-sided relationship. They both benefited from this. But Perturabo has a much higher standard in mind. You see, he is completely convinced that his real father is somewhere out there in the sky, in the heavens, in the void beyond, and one day he will come for Perturabo. There is one sentence in particular that describes Perturabo's expression on his face as he makes this clear to Damocles. It's, quote, blistering superiority, unquote. Perturabo is so convinced of his superiority to Damocles that he doesn't even stop to consider anything else. He is entirely convinced that out there somewhere is his perfect father, a perfect world, an ideal world, where again fathers do not use their sons. But, of course, that is not true, particularly in something like Olympian society. Perturabo complains that he has been used for war, for diplomacy, and absolutely he has, but on a world like Olympia, can you truly say that that is wrong? Can you say that that is immoral, incorrect? It's no different than Korax being raised by the people in the prison world of deliverance and eventually rising up to slaughter the guards. It is no different to the lion being taken in by a knightly order, raised in their ranks, and eventually used as a weapon against the great beasts of the forest. Perturabo seems to be railing against the reality of the world as it is. Damocles believes that this is due to Perturabo's need for absolute order, to be able to put everything in its place, to make everything perfect. He believes that Perturabo is working towards a utopian ideal, and Damocles knows that that is not a goal that Perturabo will ever be able to truly achieve. He also mentions something else very interesting. Perturabo once asked one of the soldiers sent out to find him if he could see a swirling star maelstrom in the sky, and the warrior had responded with puzzlement. "What star maelstrom? I can see nothing. I can only see the sky." And ever since that point in time, Perturabo never mentioned it ever again, and even though Damocles was informed of it via his guard's report, and he tried to tease the truth out of Perturabo on multiple occasions, Perturabo always avoided the subject, and Damocles suspects that this might be the root of a lot of his son's misgivings, a lot of his problems, a lot of his mental instabilities. And that may very well be the case. Because the star maelstrom is of course a very interesting subject in and of itself. We know what it is the Eye of Terror, and only Perturabo can perceive it. No one else can, not even any of the other Primarchs. At one point, he even asked Ferrus Manus if his silver eyes could perceive the maelstrom. Ferrus just looked at him strangely, and once more, Perturabo clammed up and never spoke to anyone about it ever again. Perturabo, on multiple occasions later, also talks about how the star maelstrom feels to him as if it is oppressive, as if it is pushing down upon him as if it is something evil, something cruel, and that he has lived his entire life beneath its gaze, and that it has hardened him. It has made him cynical. It has made him quick to anger, and perhaps more brutal than he would need to be. So let us therefore address the ginormous chaos pink elephant in the room, the star Maelstrom, and what effect it might have had on Perturabo's life. First and foremost, of course, we've already talked about what it is. It is the Eye of Terror, and only Perturabo can see it. Additionally, though the storytelling on this is a little bit hazy, there does not appear to be any clear mention of the star Maelstrom until after Perturabo was climbing the cliff. And there is also the idea of the storms of knowledge that wipe his mind and left him there halfway up the cliff with feelings of abandonment, something that did not happen to the other Primarchs. Was this a flaw in Perturabo's construction? A programming error in this biological supercomputer? Or was it something considerably more sinister? After all, the Chaos Gods have shown that they are more than capable of manipulating the various Primarchs as they lay in the warp. We saw this with Kurz, we saw this with Logar, we saw this more overtly with Sanguinius, although of course the Chaos Gods' plans didn't always go to plan. In this case, it is far from inconceivable that they planted a suggestion in Perturabo's mind. A suggestion of this star Maelstrom, always there, always pressing, and also that they connected the dots in his mind that this was something to be feared, that it was something dark, something malevolent, something always staring down upon him and always judging him for his actions, making him brooding, cynical, cruel, and quick to anger. Now, this again is far from inconceivable, and I do indeed believe that this is probably at the very least part of the truth, as it would be well within the power of the gods of chaos, but I do not suggest that Perturabo was some kind of happy-go-lucky little fucker before this, absolutely not. Even from his earliest memories, we know that once he saw humans and he felt a kinship to them, he did not immediately approach them, again in stark contrast to, say, for example, Ferus Manus, who immediately felt a connection to the very first humans he saw, and so wanted to seek them out, but he had already made a pledge to go and hunt down a giant silver worm, and so it would take quite some time before he could actually fulfill that urge. And so instead of thinking that the Maelstrom was what created the modern Perturabo, I instead believe that it merely shaped him, it influenced him. It used a lot of the ingredients that were already within the heart of Perturabo, within the heart of the Lord of Iron, and hypercharged them in a way. Because Perturabo, even from his earliest memories, we can tell he was always quite cold. He was also a consummate rationalist, to the point where, when he heard screaming behind him, he prioritized climbing to a point of safety before even looking around. And he was probably also always a little bit, prone to aggression, though controlled aggression being a vital difference. He did, after all, choose to make a bit of a hobby of wandering the plains of Olympia, beating monsters to death. I mean, that's pretty aggressive. And yet, on the flip side, when the herders chased him, what did Perturabo do? He could have easily just turned around and killed every last one of them without breaking a sweat, and he undoubtedly knew that as well. But instead, he chose to flee from them. He chose to run away from them. This ability to avoid conflict would be something that Perturabo, well, flat out completely lost later on in his life. And the reason why this is important to bring up is, just like has been thoroughly demonstrated within Olympian society, you need a degree of coldness, a degree of detachment, a degree of calculation and ruthlessness to exist within such a society. And Perturabo was designed to be a general, a leader of armies, and a crusher of fortifications. He was made to be the God Emperor's Lord of Iron. That is a position that, again, absolutely requires a degree of detachment and coldness and ruthless efficiency. So it's not that Perturabo didn't have these traits or were some kind of goody two-shoot lovey-dovey hippie at some point. He possessed all of them. He had to. But the Star Maelstrom took these necessary attributes, these entirely vital parts of his psyche and mind, and twisted them, bent them, and blew them out of proportions. The Lord of Iron's detached, analytical side, absolutely necessary for a general whose job it is to order men to fight and die, was turned into a kind of monstrous heartlessness, where the death of Perturabo's men were nothing to him. He didn't care for limiting their suffering. He didn't care to prevent their bloodshed. All he cared about was grinding the enemy to dust before them. And so, after decades spent beneath the baleful stare of the Star Maelstrom, the child, who had once seen a herder's boy be devoured by a monster and then went out of his way to arm himself, to prepare himself, and to slay that monster, because even if he could not prevent the needless death, he could at the very least revenge it, that young boy turned into a Primarch, who would, as his first official act, order 1/10 of his own legion beaten to death at the hands of their comrades for the sin of not being exceptional enough. Make no mistake, it was not years of service in the Emperor's crusade that turned Perturabo into a cold, callous, brutal monster. For the Beast of Iron had been born long before the Emperor arrived on Olympia. But let us for a moment return to Perturabo and his family, before we soon wrap up the Olympia part of Perturabo's history. As we have seen, Damocles certainly did try to open up to his adoptive son. He genuinely did. Maybe he wasn't as expert in it as he could have been. After all, he was a product of his environment, certainly. But he absolutely did make the effort. As for the rest of the family, well, Damocles had 2 other children, Heracon and Andos. Heracon was, not much of a child of Damocles. He was a decided disappointment, in fact, and at one point would even try to dethrone his father and would be drowned in a vat of wine as a punishment. Whereas Andos, he had the brilliant to be a fine tyrant, but he didn't have the guile or the ruthlessness. Perturabo developed quite a rivalry would be one word, although I'm not entirely sure it would be the correct one. Perturabo seemed to almost make a hobby out of routinely humiliating Andos by challenging him to various competitions in arts or paintings or mathematics or debates, and Perturabo would win every single last one of them. And yet, despite his superiority having been thoroughly proven, he kept challenging Andos to these challenges. Eventually, Andos just simply began refusing because, well, he was getting sick of being humiliated, I suppose. He removed himself from courtly life and became a sculptor of quite some renown, a worker of arts and also the metals, but Perturabo kept pestering him until eventually Andos just went like, okay, fine, we'll do one more competition. It was to be one in sculpting. Perturabo quite quickly finished his sculpture, and it was, of course, breathtakingly marvellous, but Andos spent months working on his sculpture, until finally, when the two were revealed shoulder to shoulder, it was blatantly clear to everyone who looked upon the two that Andos's creation was by far the finer sculpture. Perturabo at first seemed very cordial and nice about all of this and congratulated Andos for a victory, well deserved. But that very self-same night, Perturabo apparently snuck into the hall where the two statues were and thrashed both of them, annihilating Andos's statue to the point where it could not even be recognized as a work of the sculptor's art anymore. Whilst he also thrashed his own statue, it was nevertheless still recognizable as something that had once been of considerable beauty. This is the first truly clear sign of just unfathomably petty behavior that verges on the... I don't even know what to call it, honestly. I mean, this is a guy, because to begin with, I was kind of thinking, like, okay, maybe Perturabo sees a skill in this guy. He sees a gift in him, and wanting a brother, wanting someone to compare to himself, because he certainly did hint at that in his conversation with Damokos, when he stated that, I am not your son. I am not merely a virtuoso of Olympia. I am special. I am unique. There is no one else like me. He may simply have been feeling lonely, and so in the case of Andos, he thought he had found someone that was, at the very least, a kind of an equal to himself, and that is why he kept competing with him, kept pushing him, because it gave him a sense of brotherhood in a way. But then that happened. And suddenly, I don't think that was it at all. Suddenly, I think back to the very self-same scene with Damokos, where Perturabo showed that visage of supreme superiority. I think perhaps Perturabo, instead of seeking a genuine competition, simply just wanted to humiliate someone. So yeah, Perturabo and Andos did not have the best of relationships, leaving only his third sibling, his sister Califon. And this was also the only one of his siblings that Perturabo had any real degree of respect for. Certainly not love, that would be going much, much too far, but she was absolutely his favorite. To the point that he extended to her a courtesy that I don't think anyone else in the entire galaxy has ever received from the Lord of Iron. Perturabo allowed her to refer to him as Bo. It almost seems like such a small thing, but Perturabo would crush the skull of any other individual that even so much as tried to refer to him in such an irreverent manner. And it was even an assassination attempt, not upon Perturabo. He had had several attempts made on his life, but like he cared, he was a bloody Primarch. What could they ever truly do to him? But in one instance, his adoptive sister, Califon, was involved in one of these assassination attempts. A group of murderers took her hostage in order to try and kill Perturabo, presuming that he would not dare move against them as long as they held her. Yeah, they really didn't know Perturabo very well, now did they? He killed all of the assassins, and then he went on a war of conquest. Precisely how he pushed this is a little unclear, but presumably, since he had sworn his service to Damokos, he then began lobbying for wars against the neighboring city-states. It is also clearly stated that he definitely was a large part of pushing for these wars, even against Damokos's, wishes and wants. But, nevertheless, Olympia was then riven by internal war. Swiftly, many of the city-states moved to neutralize Locos, but with its armies commanded by Perturabo and spearheaded by many of his brilliant mechanical inventions, their armies were no match for Locos. Perturabo would soon come to siege and capture city-states that were considered by virtually all to have been impregnable. Already, we get a look at Perturabo at his coldest and most brutal, as during one siege in particular, he knowingly sacrificed a large number of his men in an assault that he knew would be extremely costly, simply to make a point, to demonstrate to the rest of all the Olympian city-states that he would not be denied. And at least here, he had a reason for his actions. You can absolutely justify this expenditure of men on that rationale. Alright, Perturabo thinks to himself. This will cause my forces to bleed more than strictly necessary. But it will demonstrate to the other city-states that regardless of their defenses, regardless of their alliances, regardless of their high walls, they will not stand. And so, you could force many of the others to just straight up surrender to him, and therefore save the blood and suffering of his forces in the long run. Perturabo was already very cold and careless in many a way with his forces, but he hadn't quite gone as crazy as he would. And of course, there was no one on Olympia that even stood a snowball's chance in hell of stopping the Primarch's war of conquest. Perturabo, in his own mind, did this to unify Olympia, to put an end to all of the pointless fighting, and to bring peace to Olympia. And once he'd finally brought peace, then he figured, then he could get to really revolutionizing Olympian society. Then he could get to building the works of peace and art that he had always dreamt of. But it was not to be. Whilst Perturabo fought multiple wars of conquest and subdued considerable portions of Olympia in Damocos and Locos' name, whilst becoming ever more bloody-minded whilst doing so, before he could complete his conquests, possibly reined in by Damocos himself, for Perturabo would not break the oath he had sworn to Damocos, and he would not betray him, even if he could easily have done so and become tyrant himself. Eventually, however, the Emperor arrived on Olympia, and Perturabo immediately sought him out and swore fealty to his true father. This was also when Perturabo was given the title of the Lord of Iron, for the Emperor had long intended for Perturabo to be his most faithful and unbreakable of servants. He was the one that the Emperor would turn to when the hardest tasks, the mightiest enemy fortresses, or the most resilient resistance needed conquering. And Perturabo immediately swore that yes, he would be the Emperor's Lord of Iron, as his oath of moment would reaffirm at the Astartes Tower on ancient Terra. None of humanity's enemies should ever build anything that Perturabo could not put asunder. And this was a great time for the young Lord of Iron. This was, perhaps, the period where he was the most content, when he might even have approached a state of happiness, even. Certainly, when he first arrived at Locos, that was a period of great learning for him, of great personal growth as well. But what both Damocos and Locos singularly failed to teach Perturabo was any sense of humility, equality, love, or friendship. And he did find at the very least some of these in the Emperor's palace on Terra. There he encountered Magnus the Red. Now, at first glance, you might think that there would be very few Primarchs less likely to be on friendly terms than the solid, firm, realistic, and calculating Perturabo, and the ephemeral, esoterical, and downright magical Magnus of Prospero. and yet the two had one thing in common. Both of them desired knowledge, both of them hungered for it, and neither one had much in the way of scruples as to where and how they should discover that knowledge. And so the two of them together delved deeply into the ancient ruins of long-lost terror. In these explorations, Perturabo would also stumble across the manuscripts of the Firenze polymath, none other than Leonardo da Vinci. And Perturabo would fall in love with this man, with his ideas, his foresight, and his creativity, and would even go to quite some extent to bring many of his more crazy and out-there designs to life. For example, he designed his Cavea Ferrum, an impassable labyrinth, in great part due to the polymath's own designs. He even stumbled across a drawing of a perpetual motion engine, a seeming impossibility, but Perturabo saw that the old polymath had been onto something. He had spotted the trick, and the only thing that prevented him from actually creating it was that he lacked the knowledge of engineering and the tools with which to craft the incredibly delicate and intricate machinery that such a creation would require. But Perturabo, he had the technology, and he also had access to Vulcan, possibly the finest craftsman in the entire galaxy, and together they managed to create a perpetual motion engine that Perturabo then housed within a miniature Warhound Titan. Now there would have been a friendship, but whilst Perturabo and Vulcan, and even Ferrus Manus as well, could probably have bonded at least to some degree over their shared love of crafting things, their temperaments were wildly different. Perturabo would almost certainly have viewed Vulcan as weak, as soft, as far too caring of the mere human populace of the Imperium. And as for Ferrus Manus, I think Perturabo may have had a soft spot for the silver-handed Gorgon, but he had asked Ferrus once if his silvery eyes could perceive the star maelstrom as well, and when Ferrus did not answer and instead looked at Perturabo as if there was something wrong with him, any hope of a friendship between the two evaporated immediately, because in Perturabo's eyes, Ferrus had now grasped onto a weakness of Perturabo. He knew of something that Perturabo had not told anyone else. He could not tolerate that, and so I imagine he would have put a great deal of distance between himself and the Gorgon. In all due likelihood, this interaction was also the reason why he never asked Magnus about the star maelstrom, and Magnus might have been able to give him some answers. Magnus might even have been able to help Perturabo with some of his ill moods by explaining the star maelstrom, by quantifying it, and by making Perturabo aware of the influence that he was having upon him. And knowing how stubborn Perturabo is, that would almost certainly have made him resist its influence with every iota of strength and stubbornness in his soul. But Perturabo had already been quite brutally rejected by one of his brothers. There is no way he would risk that humiliation again, and especially not with Magnus, someone that he seemingly quite genuinely did care for. But let us fast forward things a little bit here. Perturabo, of course, spent quite a time on Terra, interacting with his brothers that were there at the same time, and the Emperor. But let us move forward to when he climbed the Astartes Tower, like his brothers would, both before him and after him, to swear his oath of moment to the Emperor, before going out into the galaxy to continue the Great Crusade at the head of the 4th Legion Astartes. because the Emperor and Perturabo had a very interesting conversation. The Emperor specifically warned Perturabo against the evils of an unjust war, and that now that he would be put at the head of a legion, he must understand the weight of responsibility that comes with wielding such a force. And he must be absolutely certain that when he employs this mighty, devastating power, that it is against a worthy target. And Perturabo seemed to agree wholeheartedly. He paraphrased a quote from his beloved Firenze polymath that essentially amounts to, "We must leave them better after we have conquered them than when we found them." And of course, the Emperor agrees as well, even points out that it is a quote from his beloved polymath. And the two genuinely seem to get along quite well. Perturabo smiles and says, "I'd hope to pass that off as a piece of my own wisdom." Now that is crucial. Perturabo, the petulant little shit, is accepting a joke. And in a way, a little bit of a poke at his own pride, with the Emperor saying, "You quoted that from someone." When Damocos leaned over his shoulder and said, "Hard at work at your follies again, son." Again, something that would in any normal family be viewed as friendly banter. He turned on him. He ended that conversation with yelling at Damocos. And yet here, he seems to share a moment of genuine warmth with the Emperor. In fact, virtually all of Perturabo's memories of the Emperor are quite positive. The first moment when he saw him, for example, Perturabo was convinced that yes, this is my father. This is the man I will serve. And yet, like so many other things, the years and presumably the presence of the star Maelstrom warped these feelings of affections. But for now, at the very least, everything seemed to be going quite all right. Though the Emperor was a little hesitant in their conversation. He seemed a little unsettled. He talked to Perturabo about how humanity had always tried to fight evil. Perturabo immediately picked up on that term and questions it used, and the Emperor assured him that it was a turn of phrase, something that Perturabo did not quite believe. But the Emperor continued and stated that they would not fight evil with good works or prayers that people had tried before them. No, they would fight evil with bolters and chainswords. And the Emperor had also mentioned how he had seen this path up until this point, but now he was blind. Although again, the conversation suggests that he may have seen more than he was letting on. The conversation to me even read as if he might actually be suspecting Perturabo of being one of the many that might turn against him. And yet, nevertheless, the Emperor chose to trust his son and give him command of the 4th Legion Astartes, where Perturabo, after having combed through the Legion's history, decided upon the punishment of decimation. Again, decimation is an act of the ancient Roman legions where they would draw lots, and 1 in every 10 men would be the loser. They would be singled out, and their comrades, surrounding them with sticks and cudgels, would then beat the 10th man to death. It was an extraordinarily brutal punishment, only used in the most dire and extreme of circumstances. It was the nuclear option. And this, again, was Perturabo's very first action upon taking command of the Legion. And why? Well, because they were not the best. That is why. The Iron Warriors had always been, they were not the Iron Warriors yet. That was the name that Perturabo would give them. The 4th Legion had a reputation for stubbornness, beyond any point of reasonable nature. And during one compliant action, they had simply continued to assault and assault and assault until finally emerging victorious, but with massive, near crippling casualties. In the end, the so-called liberation of Incaldion cost the Legion 29,000 legionnaires and 2 million Imperial Army soldiers. Now that is bad. There is no question about it. That is bad. Those are terrible casualties. And when Perturabo took over command of his legion, he only had 35,000 Astartes at his immediate command, with perhaps as many as that again scattered across the rest of the galaxy, for a total of some 65 to 70,000 Astartes. Considering that this had been a force of near 100,000, yeah, a third of the Legion wiped out in a single compliance action? But, crucially, it was not a defeat. And yet, as the Edict of Decimation would state, quoting, "War is unequivocal, uncaring, unforgiving, and blind. Blind also will be the selection of those who will pay the blood price for the greater failure of your record." End quote. And so, a further 3,000 Space Marines were beaten to death by their comrades. And if we assume that the rest of the Iron Warriors scattered across the galaxy were also subject to the decree of decimation, then something like 6,000 to 7,000 of them were killed. And again, I stress, this was not the punishment for a defeat. This was the punishment for a hard-fought victory. Almost immediately, several of his brother Primarchs, Robute Guilliman amongst them, denounced Perturabo for these actions. Some of them even went so far as to ask for him to be removed from command. Clearly, he was not ready for the command of a legion. He was some backward, savage warlord. And yet, the Emperor stepped up for Perturabo and silenced any and all dissenting voices. He stated that no, this was Perturabo's legion. He was entitled to do with it as he wished, and he would remain in command of the Fourth. And for the rank-and-file Astartes, the pounding did not end there. Immediately upon receiving command and having carried out his act of decimation, Perturabo took the newly minted Iron Warriors back to the Olympian system to pacify the rest of it, since Olympia itself had no means of space travel, and so Perturabo had obviously not been able to engage in warfare with any of the surrounding planets. One of the most famous engagement of this particular compliance action was undoubtedly the fall of the Black Judges. Now, the Black Judges were a highly technologically advanced society that existed on the outer remits of the system. They had launched slaving raids against various worlds, including Olympia, and had become a myth, a legend of evil punishers descended from up on high in Olympian stories. Perturabo now moved to shatter these legends once and for all. And he did. It cost his legion dearly, because he used them as, well, fodder to begin with. The Iron Warriors were landed on the so-called Rock of Judgment, whereupon they were almost immediately engaged by the Black Judges and their armies of combat servitors and other horrific creations. The servitors themselves were dangerous, but not a match to an Astartes warrior. The Black Judges, however, whilst relatively few in numbers, were virtually impervious to Astartes weaponry, and each and every one of them boasted the firepower of a dreadnought. They slew dozens of Iron Warriors for each and every one of their own that was brought low by point-blank melter charges and suicide crack grenade assaults. And all the whiles, Perturabo sat by and observed. He waited. He was judging the judges. He was determining where their weaknesses lie, and where he and his devastators would have the maximum impact. and once the moment had arrived, he struck them with merciless force, hammering into the black judges, leading a newly formed foray of elite devastators known as Havocs. He cracked their shells, ripped out the soft, squishy, still human occupants, and scattered the judges to the winds, hunting down every last single one of them and destroying them. It had been yet another expensive victory, but with that, the most dangerous threat in the Meritara cluster had been neutralized, and the only remaining opposition was a small, easily dismantled Xenos empire. Finally then, Olympia and the Meritara cluster as a whole had been brought to compliance, and was declared to be the principal domain of the Iron Warriors Legion. And it would become a mighty bastion indeed. The Black Judges, as mentioned, had been extraordinarily advanced, and their huge Rock of Judgment, a hollowed-out planetoid with a massive orbital dockyard surrounding it, were dismantled and moved into orbit above Olympia. This would eventually become known as the Black Citadel, serviced by the so-called Brethren of Cold, or the Keladakos. They were the shipwraiths and the defense garrison of Perturabo's adoptive home world of Olympia. Perturabo also showed remarkable foresight and political aptitude in allowing the Adeptus Mechanicus to harvest most of the Black Judge's secrets, and this gained him a lifelong ally within the Mechanicus, who supplied the Iron Warriors with huge quantities of heavy artillery, experimental weaponry, and ships of near unrivaled durability, all of which would serve the Iron Warriors Legion very well indeed as they continued the Great Crusade, where they swiftly gained a near unrivaled reputation for brutal efficiency. And at this point in time, Perturabo had reshaped the Legion to a considerable degree. We don't know all that much about the 4th Legion Astartes before Perturabo arrived to lead it, and what we do know speaks of a history of considerable stubbornness, of an ability to ignore casualties that would have broken lesser legions, and a will to carry on regardless of the cost, of great bravery. But Perturabo would change this as well. Neither did Perturabo really bring any of the traditions of Olympia into the new way of war of what would eventually become the Iron Warriors. The Olympian way of war was traditional. It was a way of establishing and maintaining the status quo in many ways. It was a way of siege warfare, of massed battles, and of limited objectives. A fight would be picked, the fight would be waged, and it would be resolved. Indeed, individual combat between champions, as we saw at Damocles' court, could even be used to achieve objectives that might otherwise have required military means, the opening of trade, and the forced alliance between two city-states. And if there is one thing no one would ever accuse the Iron Warriors of, it would be for being too honorable in their traditions of war. Instead, the Iron Warriors under Perturabo would become something else entirely. Oh, they would certainly maintain a degree of stubbornness that even the Death Guard might look at and go, oof, that's a bit extreme, isn't it? But it was also paired with an approach to warfare that could, at best, be described as outright mathematical. In sharp contrast, for example, to how Lionel Johnson led his warriors. When the Lion took to the field, he was perhaps one of the finest tacticians and strategists in the entire galaxy, and yet his grasp of these things were almost wholly natural. He had an intuitive flair for brilliance. He didn't concoct vast and overly complex plans, nor did he really approach war as an art form. You might compare Perturabo's way of waging war to that of, say for example, the Ultramarines and their strictly ordered hierarchy during the Horus Heresy, but even that would not really be a true comparison. The Ultramarines were certainly quite heavily focused on pre-planning, doctrine and dogma, but it still was based heavily upon interpretation as well, and putting the correct individuals with the right flair for inspiration and, occasionally, a spark of brilliant individuality in the correct positions. Perhaps a comparison to Dawn's Golden Boys might be more apt, but even then, whilst there would undoubtedly be many similarities, a focus on planning, on mathematical fire patterns of preparations, and exquisite design both on the offense and the defense, Dawn would never treat his warriors the way Perturabo treated his. To Perturabo, an individual Iron Warrior was nothing more than a statistical point on a carefully drawn-up mathematical chessboard. He was a pawn to be moved, to be used, and to be expended much like a round of ammunition. And for all of Dawn's aloof and disassociated nature, I can never truly imagine him treating his Imperial fists like Perturabo treated his Iron Warriors. Dawn had a great deal of trust for his fists, which is why Sigismund's quote-unquote betrayal hit him so very, very hard. Whilst Perturabo, hell, he didn't even like his closest advisors, the Trident. He certainly didn't trust them. On more than one occasion, he played with the idea of just outright abolishing them because he didn't frankly see the need for them. And after the disastrous Battle of Fal, he created the Iron Circle. And when his brother Fulgrim asked him, "Why automata, brother? Why not living bodyguards of flesh and blood, those who love you?" And Perturabo simply stated that automata can't fail him. They can't betray him, they never sleep, and they never let down their shields. It seems quite clear that after the Imperial fists reached his throne chamber aboard the Iron Blood during the battle for the Fal system, Perturabo had felt as if his sons had let him down, and he was not about to let them do that again. Perturabo did not harbour particularly warm thoughts for his legion, not really at any point, and he would only grow even colder towards them over the years. This is what made it so easy to use them as little more than a battering ram, as tools for grinding warfare. And I suppose this is the point where we need to address the big question. The question around which the entire idea of Perturabo and his personality really revolves. Namely, what made Perturabo into what he became? What made him into a traitor? What made him into a heretic? What eventually formed him into a demon prince? Of course, we will be exploring this topic a little bit further when I get around to making a Perturabo that could have been video. But for now, let us delve into this a little bit already. So, first and foremost, there is an oft-repeated axiom. In fact, I believe it is essentially outright stated in the 30k and 40k lore that Perturabo turned against the Emperor and to Horus because he felt abandoned, betrayed, and abused. As Perturabo himself would put it, the Iron Warriors had been an unbreakable rod of iron, but over decades of maluse, of erosion and rust, even iron would eventually bend and then break. And of course, the final catalyst that drove Perturabo into Horus's arms was the purging of Olympia itself. Because Olympia, after the death of Damocos, collapsed in upon itself, Various anti-imperial factions declared open revolt against the Imperium, and the Iron Warriors' garrison, still stationed high above in orbit, did not dare intervene without direct instructions from Perturabo, because they didn't know if they were expected to pick a side, to intervene, or just let it happen. Now, of course, normal, wise thing to do, because there were pro-imperial cities that remained on Olympia as well, would have been for the garrison to immediately intervene and strike the rebelling cities, subduing them virtually instantly. Of course, the Iron Warriors' garrison on Olympia wasn't massive, but they would have had complete void superiority. Even if they couldn't strike straight into the heart of a city, and by and large I think they probably could have managed, they could simply threaten to annihilate it from orbit, maybe torch one or two cities just to show the rest what would happen. At the same time, I can also understand the ideas of the commander to wait for instructions from Perturabo, because, well, Lord of Iron was certainly not the most forgiving of masters, and if a misstep should be made here and now, that commander would probably not live to tell the tale of it. Aptly demonstrated by the fate of the officer who brought the news of Olympia's rebellion to Perturabo. The Lord of Iron killed the man out of hand, and then ordered the expeditionary force to abandon their current campaign against the Hrud and instead move back to Olympia, where he made planetfall and stated that he would receive the dignitaries of the various cities and listen to their arguments. Once they arrived, they made their arguments. They claimed, we wish to be loyal, we wish to remain within the Imperium, but the current tithes are too much, the taxes are too steep, the Legion is taking all of our young men. This is unbearable. We must have changes to this. Whereas the loyalist factions, of course, were like, no, please, we are loyal citizens, crush these rebels, all the whilst, of course, plotting how they might gain yet further power and favor. But Perturabo would have none of it. After allowing the dignitaries to squabble and bicker a little bit, he stood up and he shouted them the fuck down. He lambasted them, berated them, condemned them, and then ordered them all to die. A blissing barrage of Iron Warriors' bolter fire finished the rest. Perturabo had decided upon the punishment. Olympia would immediately cease any and all rebellious activity, and furthermore, each and every one of the city-states would slay 1/10 of their population. As Perturabo had once decimated his legion, now he would decimate his homeworld. And to begin with, no one thought he was being serious. Some resisted the Iron Warriors, some fought them, some tried to surrender. They didn't care. The 4th Legion burnt, destroyed, and annihilated every city that did not immediately comply with Perturabo's commands. Slowly but surely, the few cities that remained started doing what he had asked, sacrificing 1/10 of their population. Those who complied were allowed to live, but they were taken away as slaves for the 4th Legion, until finally the only city that remained was the old seat of Damocus, Perturabo's old home of Locus. It would have no mercy either. It had not sacrificed 1/10 of its population, and it would attempt to resist the Iron Warriors. Perturabo crushed the city's defenders and ordered his men to run amok within the city. This was such a brutal and bloodthirsty massacre of innocent civilians that even the Iron Warriors began to question. There are examples of open rebellion within the Legion where those who thought this was too far were killed by those who remained true to the Lord of Iron's orders. And as Locos burned, Perturabo advanced to the central palace where he had lived most of his early life alongside his father and brothers and sister, only to find that very self-same sister standing by the tomb of Damocos. We get some interesting insight here. Damocos had apparently been trying to work against the Imperium ever since Perturabo left, and Perturabo knew as well, but he never bothered to intervene. Damocos had never been able to gather anywhere near the strength required to actually launch a revolt, and Perturabo had presumably felt a sense of sympathy to the old man. Califon, his sister, however, who stood before him now, condemned Perturabo in the harshest possible words, and she cut straight to the heart of the Lord of Iron. She berated him for being nothing more than a petulant child with a martyr complex, someone that always had to be the victim. Poor Perturabo, never loved despite rejecting the affections of everyone around him. Poor Perturabo, always pining for peace and yet always embroiled in warfare. The builder, the poet, the architect, always with his gauntlets stained red with blood. Bullseye. Her comments struck Perturabo particularly deeply. He went into a berserk rage and strangled the life out of her. Before realizing what he had done and horrified at it, he laid her gently to rest, and whilst he was looking out over the burning ruins of Locos, hearing the screams and the report of bolter fire as his legion was massacring the civilian populace, he cried. He finally realized what he had done, and he softly said to himself, "The Emperor will never forgive me for this. The Emperor cannot forgive me for this." And that was what led him to Horus Lupercal, because Horus not only forgave Perturabo, he lauded him for it. He commanded Perturabo to never feel any guilt for what he had done on Olympia. Indeed, he should be proud over how thoroughly he had crushed the rebellion. And this is where we get to some of Perturabo's psyche. So, here's the thing. On the one hand, I would almost think that a person like Perturabo would rail against that, would hate Horus for these words, because Perturabo never actually managed to forgive himself for what he had done. He knew it was wrong. He knew he had committed a grave misdeed, and I believe his final words as well, "The Emperor cannot forgive me for this, he must not forgive me for this," was a bit of a throwback to his ideals of utopianism. Perturabo, for a lot of his life, genuinely believed that the Emperor would bring about utopia for humankind. And surely in a utopia, a deed as horrific as this could not be tolerated. It is almost as if Perturabo wanted to be punished, as if he knew that he had gone against the perfect order of things and now was seeking chastisement. And yet, when Horus offered him friendship and forgiveness, he accepted it. Perhaps as a way of protecting his ego, his sense of self-worth. And again, I'm not meaning ego there like as in egotistical. I mean it as the id, the very presence of one's being. The kind of thing that if you go too much against it, it'll literally break your mind as a person, To protect that, he may have simply decided to latch on to Horus's kindness, I suppose. Manipulative bastardness is perhaps a more apt term, but never mind. And so chose to serve another master. We also know, however, that he actually genuinely did believe in Horus. After his adventure in the Eye of Terror, where he was betrayed by his brother Fulgrim, who tried to use Perturabo as fuel to ascend to demon princedom, Perturabo vowed to never again trust anyone but the one last honorable individual left in the galaxy, Horus Lupercal. Perturabo genuinely did believe that Horus had noble intentions with his rebellion. Whether or not that was Perturabo merely tricking himself into wishful thinking, well, it is difficult to really know for sure, but we can certainly suspect it. So, let us go a little bit back again. Perturabo often pines for an idealized future. He keeps thinking of himself as a philosopher, a man of peace, an architect, a poet, etc. He wishes to build, and he often complains about how his brothers did not see his true worth. The book Angel of Exterminatus is full of this, with Perturabo pouting. Fulgrim, for example, says, "I will not make the mistake of underestimating you, brother." And Perturabo just scoffs and says, "I think you will. You all do in the end." And he takes a kind of perverse pleasure in being underestimated, as if it validates all of his worst beliefs and opinions about his brothers. Early on in his life, he apparently sought the love of many of his brothers. He crafted marvelous contraptions for them, though he did not always finish them, which is interesting as well. Again, in Angel Exterminatus, he at one point mentions that Perturabo firmly believes that only a lesser man would not complete a work that he has begun, and yet there is a golden lion resting in Perturabo's workshop, even to this day, possibly, that was supposed to be a gift to Lion L. Johnson that Perturabo never finished. Perhaps again, a part of his martyr complex, a need to feel inferior and looked down upon. Almost, again, like he takes pleasure in it. He's like, oh, everybody hates me, everybody misjudges me, everybody underestimates me. I'm the victim here. Feel bad for me. It feels almost cruel and cynical to assume such a base emotional motivation for a character as complex and advanced as a Primarch, and yet it seems to fit. Let us return also to the question of why did Perturabo never build the things he said he wanted to? His Cavia Ferrum, his Cave of Iron, was filled with magnificent drawings and architectural sketches, and yet he completed almost none of them. He completed one clock tower for Guilliman, which he accepted and put in pride of place, which should have been at least some kind of a acknowledgement of Perturabo's skill, and yet apparently that was, again, clearly not enough. He made the Nicaean trial, the trial center of Nicaea, where Magnus was brought. Now, that was a bad move on behalf of the Emperor. Perhaps the Emperor thought that Magnus might be vindicated, but making Perturabo build a court to condemn one of his most beloved brothers, that rankled deeply. And then, with the whole Fulgrim betrayal thing, Fulgrim asked him to build a grand amphitheater, and in the midst of that, Fulgrim was the victim of an assassination attempt. At least at the time, Perturabo felt quite warmly about Fulgrim, because, well, the Phoenician was manipulating him, trying to get him to come within the Eye of Terror and assault an Eldar fortress of the dead. More about that in the Angel of Exterminatus Horus Heresy lore breakdown video, which will probably arrive in not too long, I'm hoping. But again, why were these the only... So two exceptions to the rule, or three if you count the clock, I suppose. And yet on Olympia, he did build a lot of other things. For example, the starport was a massive statue with an outheld hand as a landing port. That is mentioned in The Architect of the Emperor, where the Remembrances marvels at the incredible architectural achievements of this thing. They look at statues all over Olympia, glorifying the 4th Legion and the Primarch, and yet the populace live like they always have. They live squalid, poor lives that have changed virtually nothing since Olympia was a feudal society ruled by tyrants in massive fortified city-states. Why did Perturabo not improve these people's lives? Why did he not build the great bathhouses? Why did he not create the revolutions he apparently wanted? And He did have every opportunity. This is another excuse I see. Oh, Perturabo was too busy. He was constantly used for war across the galaxy. I don't buy that for an instant. The Primarchs had a huge amount of self-governance, essentially. In Angel Exterminatus as well, Perturabo notes upon that if he had chosen to do so, at any point in time, he could have gone to the Star Maelstrom and no one would have questioned him. Because he was the Primarch. He was the Lord of a Legion. As demonstrated by Guilliman, if he wanted to take a few years off and build vast monuments, rebuild societies, he could have. Lorgar continued on with his nonsense directly against the Emperor's decrees for, well, God only knows how long. It took a long time of clear and obvious betrayal de facto against the Emperor, and also a pace of conquest that was the slowest of all the legions for the Emperor to finally chastise Lorgar. Then there's no way Perturabo didn't know that he could have taken a few years off to do whatever he wanted. There's no way Perturabo did not have that power to do that. Hell, even something like tasking orders, it was well within Perturabo's power to simply just refuse. Okay, well, I will send a part of my legion, but I will stay and finish this. You could argue that his sense of responsibility might force him to do that, but Perturabo was a cold and calculating person. I don't think something like that would have really swayed him over much. There is also, of course, the idea that the Iron Warriors and Perturabo were worn down over the years of abuse, of constantly being at the forefront of the fighting, and never receiving any recognition for their efforts. This is another very interesting thing. Why did they not receive any recognition? Well, Perturabo did his level best to outpace the remembrancers who were assigned to him, so he certainly wasn't seeking glory. Nor was he a great patron of the arts. The one time he sought out a painter, it was to burn his work because it did not display the Iron Warriors in the glory that Perturabo felt that they deserved. There is also the fact that there is a mention that the Iron Warriors may have been extraordinarily violent towards the worlds that they conquered. There is actually several mentions. There is one in Angel Exterminatus where they comment upon how the Imperial Fists had such loyalty amongst the Imperial populace that they had raised considerable numbers of local militia and levy to fight alongside them against the Iron Warriors. They noted that the civilian populace had sought the Imperial Fist's protection, and they note, "The conqueror makes fair his walls, and the populace love them for it," referring to that the Imperial Fists had built things. They had created wonders, walls, a golden cage, essentially, and so the populace loved them. Meanwhile, the Iron Warriors, well, there is one other quote which asks, "Where are the baying hordes?" Asking for news of the 4th Legion, asking for news of their sons. They are all dead and dust in the continental funeral pyres of Olympia, suggesting that the only ones who may have wanted news of the Iron Warriors were the Olympians. What about all of the other worlds that the Iron Warriors conquered? What about those populaces? Again, Guilliman conquered hundreds of worlds and they loved him for it. The Imperial Fists conquered worlds and their populace loved them for it. The Lunar Wolves conquered worlds and their populace loved them for it. What did Perturabo and his Iron Warriors do to be so seemingly universally despised by those they conquered? Did they even leave anyone conquered behind them? There is a mention that the Iron Warriors established bastions on the worlds that they conquered to protect Imperial settlers. Now, that is not, by any stretch of the imagination, truly, solid proof, but it does indicate that perhaps there was no populace left after the conquest, and instead they were being replaced by other Imperial settlers. After all, where are the men and women baying for news about their sons in the 4th Legion? all death and dust. It seems extreme, even by the Iron Warrior standards. There is also, of course, the fact that they never sought any glory. Even legions like the Raven Guard, for example, where Korax stated that he had no problem with being the backdrop character, someone that didn't get all of the glory like the Lunar Wolves with their dramatic drop pod assaults. Korax was fine with that, because he knew that the Emperor appreciated him. Perhaps Perturabo never received that valediction, that appreciation from the Emperor? Perhaps, but considering how he treated Damikos, it's a speculation, but I think it might be even more likely to suggest that maybe he received it and rejected it. Bearing in mind, that is speculation, of course. But furthermore, the final point as well, the Iron Warriors used and abused. Again, they could have chosen to change their doctrines. The Hrud campaign is the perfect example of this as well. The Saktrada Deeps campaign, where the Iron Warriors were sent to wipe out the alien Hrud, a mysterious species capable of bending the flow of time around them, an absolutely horrifying opponent that even if you kill them, they will age you. Every time the Iron Warriors fought them, legionnaires would be reduced to withered ancient husks, even if they survived, that is. It was the campaign that reduced a certain warsmith, Barabbas d'Antioch, to little more than a crippled old man, constantly racked by debilitating coughing fits. A space marine, reduced to a frail old man. Yeah, the Hrud were pretty horrifying. There's even a point where Perturabo suggests that it almost felt as if the Emperor gave him this mission to go on this campaign, hoping that he would fail, but Perturabo would prove everyone wrong. Now, there's the thing, it's assuming malice on behalf of the Emperor. I think this might be one of the clues to why the Iron Warriors were so used and abused. It was because Perturabo would never refuse. He would never say, no, I need time to build up my legion. No, we need a break. Or even just, again, change his tactics. Once it was made abundantly clear that the Saktrada Deeps campaign was about to end in humiliating defeat and the possible annihilation of the Iron Warriors' expeditionary fleet, whilst engaged in a massive naval battle with the Hrud's main force, indeed possibly the entirety of the Hrud species, Perturabo refused to retreat. He would rather stand and face the annihilation of not only himself, but his entire expeditionary fleet, rather than simply accept defeat and retreat. And of course, he blamed the Emperor for this. Maybe it's just me, but that sounds incredibly unreasonable. Hey, General! I blame you for sending me on this mission that I refuse to withdraw from. This mission that I refuse to disengage from. This mission that I would see to the destruction of my expeditionary fleet. That is absurd logic. But Perturabo, of course, punished Barabbas d'Antioch for his perceived failures. D'Antioch salvaged his grand company once it was made abundantly clear that they were about to be annihilated by the Hrud, and Perturabo punished him. And yet the Emperor is the uncaring bad guy here? I'm sorry, but I really don't see it. And again, no one forced the Iron Warriors to adopt this war as a mathematical equation approach to things. As Rogal Dorn once put it, if the enemy so much as thought of a wall, Perturabo would pelt it with our legionnaires until it crumbled. Paraphrasing there, I don't have the quote directly to hand at the moment, but it certainly does make a point, doesn't it? Now again, sure, the Iron Warriors were often called upon due to their specialization in siegecraft. They were often asked to crack the most difficult of objectives, But they were engaged in countless wars besides that. Perturabo must absolutely have had the opportunity to engage in other forms of warfare, and yet when he had the choice, he always fell back on this. In his war against the Hrud, what did he do? He established choke points and forced them onto his guns, into a massed naval battle in which attrition was inevitable, and the cold brutality of the math of war was the only way forward. In the end, I must say that I am forced to agree with Damocos's youngest daughter, Caliphone. I've been calling her Caliphon. I feel like I have. I'm assuming it's pronounced Caliphone, but I could be wrong on that as well. That Perturabo had a martyr complex. He always felt, well, bad about himself, and to a degree this was not his fault. The baleful presence of the star Maelstrom absolutely did darken his humor, and it made him brooding. It made him, well, vulnerable to anything and everything. As Damocos said, Perturabo would nurse every slight for weeks. He could hold a grudge like no one else. And he did. In the end, I believe that the root cause why the Iron Warriors were used and abused like they were had far less to do with the Emperor and far more to do with Perturabo himself. And again, I'm not blaming Perturabo for this. I honestly am not. I know it probably sounds like I am, but he was affected by the star Maelstrom. We don't know how much, but he was affected from a very early age. He was corrupted. The influence of chaos was playing its tricks upon him from his, literally, earliest memory. Because we know that the youth that Perturabo once was, the youth that spent a year in the wilderness of Olympia, was a very different person to the Perturabo that would eventually bend the knee to Horus Lupercal. And I will wrap this video up on the true tragedy of that choice as well. Perturabo may have rebelled against the Emperor because he felt that he had done something inexcusable, something unforgivable, something that could not be allowed in the utopia that he believed the Emperor was trying to create. And on that note as well, I will give Perturabo one further defense. One of the potential reasons I can see why he chose to not build, why he chose to not revolutionize society, was because he was of the opinion that it would have been wasted time. Now hear me out here. Perturabo may simply have reasoned that if he threw all his efforts into war now, then he could win the crusade. Humanity could rule the stars unobstructed and unopposed, and then, when peace was secured, when the Imperium of man was safe, then he could build, then he could construct without any threat of it being taken asunder. If he spent a year now building up a planet, fixing it, revolutionizing it, making it a utopia, then that very self-same planet could be a burning wreck a week from then, after having been exposed to alien raiders. And so perhaps, to a cold, calculating, meticulous mind like Perturabo, it would be better to end the war, end the crusade 1 year early, and then get to building, instead of building something now that might not survive the conflict. At least that is one of my interpretations of why he may have chosen this path. But back to Perturabo's tragic end, because he bent the knee to Horus Lupercal, thinking that he was perhaps the last honorable individual in the galaxy, the last person who truly valued Perturabo, the last person who truly saw his worth, beyond simply just being a siege master, beyond being simply just a mud-grubbing defender of trenches. But then, when Reboot Gilliman and his Ultramarines found a way through the ruin storm, and so began threatening the rear lines of Horus's crusade, who did Horus Lupercal send to hold the line, to grub in the dirt, to dig trenches? he sent Perturabo, the Lord of Iron. Because that is all that Perturabo was to Horus Lupercal. Now, perhaps Perturabo was completely right about the Emperor. Perhaps the Emperor did use and abuse Perturabo. Perhaps he really was the rust that ate away at the iron and eventually saw it bend. But I ask you at the end of this video, is it not possible, is it not indeed even more likely, that just like Damokos, the Emperor did care for Perturabo, and Perturabo wouldn't let him? Perturabo would not accept that love, because if he did, he would have to give up his martyr complex. He would no longer be the victim. He would no longer be Perturabo, the ignored one. He would no longer be Perturabo, the underestimated one. And this too, I do believe, is the core reason why he did not build, why he did not revolutionize society, why he did not try to bring about his utopia. Because he was afraid of failure. If he failed, then all of his naysayers, all of his evil brothers and his abusive father would look upon him and go, Perturabo, you weren't that big of a deal after all. And even worse, if Perturabo built his monuments, if he built his societies, and his brothers and his fathers, just like Damokos had done in that tower back on Olympia, if they came to him and said, wow, this is amazing, brother. This is fantastic, son. You truly are a great architect. You are a fine builder. Perturabo would then have to come face to face with his own misgivings, the fact that he had not given his brothers or his father the benefit of the doubt, that he had always condemned them, and now that he had finally shown them what he could do, well, he turned out to be the bad guy. He turned out to be the person who thought the worst of everything else. His martyr complex could not handle that. And again, maybe Perturabo was completely right. Maybe the Emperor was the bad guy. It does not unfortunately change, however, the fact that Horus was no better, and if I am right and the Emperor did genuinely care for Perturabo, but Perturabo would not let him, then the true tragedy, of course, is that Perturabo made himself. The Lord of Iron was the rust that ate away at the metal. The Lord of Iron was the thing that finally forced the metal to bend. It was not the Emperor. It was not the endless wars. It was not the Great Crusade. It was not even Horus Lupercal that finally bent the unbendable Lord of Iron. It was Perturabo himself. If nothing more, it is an interesting thought. And all the way here at the end, I want to, just add in a little bit of an author's note here. I almost feel like I should end it on that dramatic note, but I can't help it, because I want to add in a little bit of a more personal take here, all the way at the end of this 2-hour-plus video. And this was a difficult video to make. This was genuinely a really hard one, because Perturabo is a bit of a victim of the literary version of too many cooks at the pot syndrome. Perturabo has been covered by quite a few authors, and many of them have had wildly different takes on the Lord of Iron. Perturabo in The Hammer of Olympia, for example, seems like a completely different individual from the one in Emperor's Architect, what we hear from him secondhand there. And that Perturabo seems like a completely different individual to the Perturabo we see in the Battle of Fel. And he again seems like a completely different individual to the Perturabo that we see again in Angel Exterminatus. He changes so much, and in really fundamental ways as well. For example, his bout with his brother where he lost the statue competition. He destroyed that. He hated it. He couldn't handle that in the slightest, and yet in Hammer of Olympia, when he is proven via an equation that he is incorrect in a particular question, he accepted no questions whatsoever. Immediately he is on board with this new solution, and he does not hold a grudge against the person who proved him wrong in the slightest. Like, holy shit, that is some 360 nonsense right there. And so this was a very difficult video to make because of that. I had to kind of piece together the portions of Perturabo that were identifiable, essentially, and then make a lore video about him. And we haven't completely exhausted the topic either, because of course he turns into a demon prince, but I felt as if that might be a different subject, because I almost feel as if at that point Perturabo is not even really Perturabo anymore. And good God. So I'm recording this fine little author's note here at 6 o'clock in the morning. Grand total, not taking into account, the time spent mulling over the video, the time spent planning it, the time spent, figuring all of this out and reading all of the various books, I spent about 15 hours recording these 2 hours. Just recording them, recording a bit, then retaking it, then recording a bit, then going back and listening through and re-recording and so on. This was a hard one. This was a genuinely difficult one. In the end, I think I'm fairly happy with the result. I have a feeling this is one of those videos that I'm going to look back upon in like a week and be like, I should have covered that too. I should have talked about that. Or maybe I should have interpreted this slightly differently. Maybe I should have put a bit more weight on the Hammer of Olympia versions of Perturabo. Or maybe I should have gone a bit more for the Emperor's Architect. Maybe I was too kind. Did I give him too much wiggle room? Did I give him too many excuses? Or maybe, on the other hand, maybe I was too harsh. Maybe I attributed too much agency, in a way, to Perturabo. It was a hard one. It was a genuinely difficult one, it was. So, I'll just leave it at that. I shan't whinge at you any further. Until next time, I have been Arch. Thank you all very much for watching. If you enjoyed it, if you somehow made it all the way here, please do consider sharing the video around, leaving a like if you liked it, leaving a comment if you're interested in having a talk about Perturabo, and of course, definitely give me your opinions on it as well, It'd be cool to hear. So, have a good day.